Go to Dublin, the retired RCMP officer told me at my mother's graveside. Walk into the office on Baggot Street. Give them her name. They'll know what to do. I remember the cold more than anything else. It came off the Rideau River that November morning like it had somewhere to be, cutting through the wool of my coat and settling into my shoulders. The cemetery outside Ottawa was quiet, in the way only Canadian winter can make a place quiet, heavy, absolute, final. There were 3 other people within sight. The groundskeeper near the cedar hedge, an older woman I didn't recognize, standing 2 rows back with her hands folded, and the retired officer standing directly in front of me, his eyes steady, his voice low enough that it barely reached me across the fresh earth. My mother had been buried 20 minutes earlier. No eulogy, no reception, no flower arrangements with sympathy cards tucked inside. Just a priest, a casket, a flag from her years with the federal government, and me. My older brother, Mark, hadn't come. He said he had a work conflict in Calgary. I stopped believing that kind of thing years ago. My mother had been a quiet woman her entire life. She worked 31 years as an administrative coordinator for the Department of National Defense in Ottawa. Not a soldier, not an officer. The kind of person who kept everything running and received no ceremony for it. She drove a used Civic, brought her lunch to work in a thermal bag, and kept her thermostat at 17 degrees even in January because she said anything higher was wasteful. When she retired, her colleagues gave her a card signed by 40 people and a potted orchid. She kept that orchid alive for 11 years. She died of a stroke on a Tuesday. The neighbor 2 doors down, a retired teacher named Mrs. Beauchamp, had noticed her porch light left on 2 mornings in a row and knocked. I got the call at my desk in Toronto, where I work as an insurance underwriter. I remember staring at the window and watching a pigeon walk along the ledge outside and thinking that seemed wrong that ordinary things should stop for a moment. Her estate, as I had always assumed, was modest. The house in Kanata, a small savings account, some government pension paperwork. She had never mentioned investments. She had never mentioned much of anything about money, except to say that debt was a kind of weakness she refused to carry. The retired officer's name was Gilles Trottier. He had served with the RCMP for 35 years before retiring to a small property near Almonte. He was broad-shouldered, precise in his movements, the kind of man who stands still like he means it. He introduced himself only by name, not by what he had done. I noticed the RCMP veteran's lapel pin only after he had already spoken. "I served alongside your mother," he said. Not in the field, she wasn't that. But she was the kind of person operations depend on, and we all knew it. I had no response to that. My mother had never once mentioned this man. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and handed me a card. Plain white, no logo, no official letterhead. A Dublin address on Baggot Street, a phone number with an Irish country code, and a name I didn't recognize written in careful print. "Go to Dublin," he said. "Walk in. Give them her name. They'll know what to do." He shook my hand, nodded once, and walked back toward the cemetery road. The older woman I had noticed earlier was already gone. I stood at my mother's grave holding that card until my fingers went numb. I didn't tell Mark about it. That evening I drove back to her house in Kanata. I still had a key from years ago. The place smelled the way it always had: cedar and dish soap and something faintly herbal from the tea she made every night before bed. Her reading glasses were on the kitchen table beside a half-finished crossword. The pencil was still there. She had been working in pencil because she said pens were for people who were certain. I moved through the house slowly. Her filing cabinet in the second bedroom was organized the way she organized everything. Alphabetically, clearly labeled, nothing extraneous. I found her tax returns going back 22 years, her pension documents, her home insurance renewals, her car maintenance records. Everything accounted for, everything modest, nothing that suggested anything beyond what I had always known. Then I found the passport in the drawer of her bedside table. It was a renewed Canadian passport, current, and it had been used: Dublin twice, Edinburgh once, Geneva twice, Reykjavik, all within the past 9 years, none of them trips I had known about. She had told me she was visiting a former colleague named Ruth who had moved to Halifax. She had told me the same story 4 times. I sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Mark called around 9 that evening. He didn't ask about the burial. He asked whether the house had been appraised recently, and whether I had spoken to the estate lawyer yet. "There's not much to divide," I told him. He exhaled slowly. "There's the house. I know about the house. That's worth something in this market, he said. Even in Kanata, that lot? I told him I'd be in touch and I ended the call. I looked at the Dublin card again. I was not someone who acted on impulse. My job is built on probability assessment, on understanding what can go wrong before it does. Everything in my professional instinct told me to hand this card to an estate lawyer and let them make the appropriate inquiries. Everything else told me to book the flight myself. I booked the flight myself. I didn't tell Mark where I was going. I told him I was driving to Kingston to pick up some documents from a government records office plausible enough that he wouldn't push. He didn't. He sent a follow-up text asking me to photograph any financial documents I found. I left that one unread. I brought her passport with me, along with her death certificate, a copy of the probate filing, and my own identification. On the overnight flight from Toronto to Dublin, I sat in a window seat and watched the lights of the city disappear below the clouds, and I thought about how little I had known my mother as a person rather than a presence. She had been there every Sunday phone call. She had mailed me soup when I had my wisdom teeth removed. She had never told me anything about passport stamps or Irish offices or retired RCMP officers who showed up at gravesides. Dublin in November is grey and clean and purposeful. The cab from the airport was warm and the driver talked about the rugby until I stopped responding, and then he stopped too, without offense. Baggot Street was in the center of the city, lined with Georgian brick buildings and small brass plaques beside heavy doors. The office I was looking for was on the third floor of one of those buildings, identified only by a number and a name. I won't repeat here because it wasn't the sort of name that meant anything until you already knew what it was. The woman at the reception desk was perhaps 60, calm-faced, with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain. I gave her my mother's name. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "We've been waiting to hear from you." She asked me to sit. A man arrived within minutes, wearing a dark gray suit, carrying a folder, moving with the same measured unhurriedness as everyone in that office seemed to operate under. "We were sorry to hear about your mother," he said. She was a woman of considerable discipline. He used that word discipline, and I thought of her crossword pencil, her 17-degree thermostat, her 31 years of lunches packed in a thermal bag. He opened the folder on the table between us. My mother had established a private charitable trust in 2004 through a Dublin-based legal structure, common among Canadians working with international bodies at the time, he explained. She had contributed consistently for 19 years. The trust had been invested conservatively and had compounded steadily. She had never withdrawn from it for personal use. Not once. The total value at the time of her death was just over $9 million Canadian. I asked him to repeat that. He did. I said, "My mother drove a used Civic." He said yes. That was her choice. I looked at the documents. Her signature on the original filing looked exactly the way she signed birthday cards. Small, precise, slightly to the left of center. "What was it for?" I asked. He turned a page. "The trust was structured to support a specific category of recipients," he said, "federal public servants and their families who had experienced hardship following injury, illness, or financial collapse related to government contract restructuring. People who had fallen through the gaps of the official systems. Several of them," he said, "were former colleagues." "She never said anything," I said. He folded his hands. She was clear about that. The condition of her help was that no one knew she was helping. He slid a sealed envelope across the table, written in her handwriting, to be given only after her death. My phone buzzed. "Mark." I let it ring twice and answered. "So?" he said immediately. "Kingston, you found something?" "I'm still going through documents," I said. "Is there money?" he asked. "Because I've been looking at the probate and it seems like there might be accounts that weren't—" "I'll call you later," I said, and hung up. I picked up the envelope. Her handwriting inside was the same as it always had been. Neat, left-leaning, deliberate. She had written in pen this time. She began by saying that she had not hidden this from me out of secrecy. She had hidden it because she knew what money did to the way people listened, and she needed me to understand the work before I understood the amount. She wrote that in her second decade at D&D, she had watched colleagues, good people, careful people, lose everything when their departments were restructured and their contracts reclassified. Disability claims that stalled. Pensions that didn't cover what the forms had promised. Children who had to leave university. Mortgages that couldn't be held. She had started the trust quietly. She had used a Dublin firm because an Irish-registered charitable structure offered specific legal protections for this type of beneficiary arrangement that Canadian domestic law made more complicated. She had found a financial advisor she trusted. She had contributed steadily, and she had told no one. "You don't announce help," she wrote. "You make it reliable." There was one more line. "I chose you as the trustee because you understand what it costs when a system fails a person who followed all the rules. You see it in your work. I need you to continue seeing it." I folded the letter and held it for a moment. The man in the gray suit returned. "There is also a current list of active beneficiaries," he said. "They are not aware of your mother's passing. Disbursements are scheduled quarterly." He placed another folder on the table. Mortgage assistance for a widow in Fredericton whose husband had died waiting for a D&D disability ruling. Tuition support for 2 adult children of a former colleague who had developed early-onset Parkinson's. Medical transport funding for a man in Thunder Bay receiving cancer treatment not covered under his restructured benefits package. My mother had never mentioned any of this. Of course she hadn't. I flew back to Toronto the next morning. Mark texted twice during the layover in London. Both messages asked variations of the same question. I responded to neither. When I landed at Pearson and turned my phone off airplane mode, I had a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. A lawyer in Ottawa, calm-voiced, telling me that Mark had engaged her office to review the estate disclosure and that they had some concerns about whether all assets had been properly identified in the probate documentation. He had moved faster than I expected. I called an estates lawyer in Ottawa the following morning. Her name was Patricia Hennessy. She was recommended by a colleague, and when I walked her through everything, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Your mother was thorough." "She was," I said. Patricia reviewed the trust documentation over the following 2 days. Everything was in order. The Dublin structure was legally sound. The disbursements were documented. The Canadian tax treatment was compliant, and the trust deed clearly named me as successor trustee upon my mother's death. Mark's lawyer filed within 3 weeks. The claim cited lack of transparency in the estate disclosure, failure to identify foreign-held assets, and potential undue influence over the deceased by unnamed parties. Legal language takes something that is essentially grief and reroutes it through procedure, which in some ways makes it easier to face. The first hearing was in an Ottawa courtroom on a gray February morning. Mark sat at the opposing table in a suit I hadn't seen before, his jaw tight, not looking at me when we came in. He looked the way he always had when he was frightened, rigid, leaning slightly forward, looking for the angle. His lawyer argued that the trust represented a foreign-held asset that should have been identified and that its structure unfairly excluded a legitimate heir under Ontario succession law. Patricia responded quietly and precisely. The trust predates any claim by 19 years. It was established legally, maintained in compliance, and referenced in the domestic estate filing. The successor trustee designation was explicit and uncontested. The judge requested additional documentation and set a second hearing. Outside the courtroom, Mark spoke to me directly for the first time since I had arrived. "You could settle this," he said. "Just tell me what's actually in it." "I told you," I said. "It's a charitable trust. It supports former public servants." "How much?" "9 million, I said. He went still. "And you're just going to what, manage it?" "That's what she asked me to do." He shook his head slowly. "She never helped me like that." "She helped you differently," I said. He looked up. "What does that mean?" I hesitated, then decided he deserved to know. "After your divorce," I said. "The legal fees you couldn't cover. The car loan in 2018. He stared at me. "She paid those," I said. Quietly, through the family stabilization clause she'd built into the trust for exactly that kind of situation. He didn't speak for a long moment. He didn't know, I realized. He genuinely hadn't known where that money had come from. "She told me it was from savings," he said finally. "It was," I said, "just not the savings you knew about." He looked away. His jaw worked once and then stopped. At the second hearing, Patricia introduced the full trust documentation, 19 years of contribution statements, disbursement records, legal certifications from the Dublin firm, and a letter from Gilles Trottier, confirming that my mother had discussed her intention to establish long-term support for specific former colleagues years before her death, and that no third party had influenced her decisions. He submitted his testimony in writing. He was 71 and didn't travel well, but his statement was precise and his credentials were unambiguous. Mark's lawyer questioned whether the trust had been disclosed in a timely manner. Patricia's response was clean. The existence of a foreign-held trust is not a requirement under Ontario probate law provided it is separately administered. The domestic estate was properly filed. The trust operates independently. On the third hearing, the judge ruled, "The trust is validly constituted," she said. "There is no evidence of improper disclosure or undue influence. The petitioner's claim is dismissed." Mark didn't look at me when it was read. Outside the courthouse, the February sky was low and white, and there was salt on the steps from a recent freeze. Mark stood beside his car for a moment before he spoke. "She really built all that," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. And she never said a word to either of us." "No." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I've been fighting you over money she was using to help strangers." I thought about the right way to answer that. "They weren't strangers to her," I said. "They were people she had watched fall through the cracks, and she had the means to stop it, so she did." He didn't respond immediately. I watched him process it the way he always processed things he hadn't expected, slowly, with visible discomfort, then with something quieter underneath. I drove home that evening and sat at my kitchen table with the trust documents spread out in front of me and reread her letter. She had been right about what money does to the way people listen. For a few weeks, Mark had only heard numbers. I had been half afraid I would too. But the number had never felt like mine. It had felt like a filing cabinet I had been handed the key to, full of things she had organized over decades for reasons that had nothing to do with me personally, and everything to do with who she had decided to be. I called Mark the following Sunday. He answered. "I want to walk you through the trust," I said. "Not the legal structure, what it actually does, who it actually helps." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. We spent an hour on the phone. I told him about the family in Fredericton and the man in Thunder Bay, and the tuition payments and the medical transport fund. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, "She never told you she was doing any of this." "No, not once. Not once." He exhaled slowly. "She really was something. She really was." There was a pause on the line. "I have some debt," he said. "A couple of things from the last few years that have gotten heavy." He said that word the way people say things they've been carrying for a while without putting down. "I know," I said. "How do you know?" "Because I pulled the records when Patricia was reviewing the estate," I said. "I wanted to understand the full picture." He didn't take offense at that, which surprised me. "There's a family stabilization provision built into the trust," I said. "Structured distributions, financial counseling, documented accountability. She used it for you before without you knowing. I can use it the same way, if you're willing to do the work." "You mean conditions?" "I mean structure," I said. "The same kind she believed in." He was quiet for long enough that I thought he was going to refuse. Then he said, "She really did think of everything, didn't she?" "She thought in decades," I said. "Not years." He laughed once, brief and quiet. That was so her. It took 3 more conversations before he agreed to the terms. I paired him with a financial counselor in Calgary, a woman named Renee who had worked with the trust before on other cases. Within 4 months, he had restructured 2 of his 3 debts and closed a line of credit that had been accumulating interest since 2020. He was not transformed. He was not suddenly someone else. Almost a year after the court dismissed his claim, Mark flew out to Ottawa in October. We drove together to the cemetery on a Sunday morning when the maples along the Rideau were at their peak, that particular Canadian orange that looks almost unreasonable against a gray sky. We hadn't arranged to visit at the same time. He had called the night before and said he was coming, and I had said I would be there too, and that had been enough. Her headstone was simple. Name, dates, and a small maple leaf pressed into the stone at her request, because she had been specific about that the same way she had been specific about everything. No inscription. She hadn't wanted words. She said the life was the inscription. Mark stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at her name for a long time. "I thought she had nothing," he said. "I thought so too." He shook his head. "We were so wrong about her." We stood there for a while without speaking. The wind moved through the maples, and a few leaves came down, unhurried, turning slowly in the air the way leaves do when there's nothing rushing them. Before we left, he cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the filing, for the calls, for all of it." "I know," I said. He nodded once, the way our mother used to nod when something was settled and didn't need more words. On the drive back into the city, I thought about the first time I had opened her letter in that quiet office on Baggot Street, with Dublin rain on the window and a folder of documents that had rearranged everything I thought I understood. She had written, "You don't announce help, you make it reliable." I had read that line a dozen times since, and each time it meant something slightly different. There are nights when the weight of what she left me feels enormous: the quarterly reviews, the disbursement decisions, the correspondence with the Dublin office, the careful work of making sure the money goes where it was intended. There are nights when I think about how much simpler it would have been to liquidate everything and divide it cleanly, and let the trust become a line in a probate record that no one remembers. Then I think about the man in Thunder Bay getting to his treatments because the transport costs are covered. I think about the daughter in New Brunswick who started her second year of nursing school because the tuition arrived on time. I think about what my mother built for 19 years in complete silence, without acknowledgement, without credit, because she believed that certain people deserved not to fall through the floor, and she had the means to put something there. She was an administrative coordinator who drove a used Civic and worked in pencil, and kept her house at 17 degrees in January. She was also someone who had looked at a broken system and decided, quietly and without complaint, to fix the part of it she could reach. The trust will continue. It is structured to outlast me if it needs to. The Dublin office has succession protocols, and Patricia is already helping me build Canadian oversight provisions into the documentation. My mother planned it to run beyond any single person's tenure because she understood that reliable help cannot depend on any one person remaining available. Mark sends me a budget update every month now. He doesn't have to. The counseling agreement only requires it quarterly. He does it because, I think, he has started to understand what accountability actually means when it isn't coerced. We are not the same as we were. We are not without history or edges, but we no longer have resentment sitting at the center of everything, and that is something she would have called progress. I keep her last letter in the same drawer she kept her passport, the one by the bedside table in the house in Kanata, which I have not yet sold and am not sure I will. Some mornings I drive out there before work and sit at the kitchen table where she used to do her crossword in pencil, and I drink my coffee, and I think about what she was thinking in all those years of quiet, whether she had doubted herself, whether she had wanted to tell someone, whether she had looked at the trust statements and felt something that looked like pride. I think she probably just felt that it was the right thing, and that feeling was sufficient, and that anything more would have been decoration. She was not someone who needed decoration. There is a framed photograph on the kitchen wall that I never noticed until after she died. It's small, tucked between the clock and the window. A picture of her standing outside a building I now recognize as the one on Baggot Street. She is wearing her gray wool coat, the one she wore every winter for 12 years. She is not smiling at the camera. She is looking slightly to the side, the way people look when they have just finished something that mattered and haven't had time to decide how they feel about it yet. That is the photograph I think about when people ask me what she left behind. Not $9 million. Not a legal structure registered in Dublin. Not a trust with successor protocols and quarterly disbursements. Just a woman standing outside an office in the rain who had done what she believed was right and was already thinking about what came next. If this story made you think of someone in your own life, someone who gave without announcing it, who built something quietly while you were busy assuming you knew everything about them, take a moment with that today. Call them if you still can. Ask them the questions you've been putting off. And if you believe that strength doesn't need to be loud to be real, I hope you'll stay with this channel. Tell me in the comments who that person was for you. Because sometimes the most important inheritance isn't something you can hold. It's a standard someone lived by, long before you were paying attention.